So, in the last lecture, I talked a bit about what we mean by distributive justice, what we are talking about when we talk about questions of distributive justice. In this lecture, I want to talk a little bit about one possible approach to distributive justice. And even though Dworkin doesn't say this in the clip I gave you guys, this is an approach to justice that Rawls is very critical of. And that is utilitarianism. And when Rawls wrote his book, which he wrote in the early 70s, which I guess is quite a while back now, makes me feel old to say that, but it's true. But so when Rawls wrote his book, the main way of thinking about questions of justice, including distributive justice, was utilitarianism. And Rawls thinks there are some pretty deep problems with that. That utilitarianism is not a good way, or at the very least, not a sufficient way to think about these questions of distributive justice. And I tend to agree with Rawls for reasons that we will see today. So, and I think it's important to talk about this because utilitarianism, even though there are some problems with this as a way of thinking about distributive justice, it is actually a pretty popular way to think about these issues. I don't know that it should be for reasons we'll talk about today, but this is a way a lot of people will approach these. So remember, utilitarianism is all about creating the greatest overall happiness. Well, how does that feed into these questions of distributive justice? Well, pretty easy, right? You distribute money, resources, land, whatever. When you're distributing things as a society, you want to create the greatest overall happiness. To put it really crudely, but I don't think misleadingly, slice up the economic pie in such a way that you create the greatest happiness. Now this is actually, I think, a pretty common way to think about these issues on both the left and the right. And if you pay attention to political debates, you'll see this. You might find someone on the right advocating for a tax cut, arguing, well, if we cut taxes, it'll stimulate the economy. If we do that, everybody will have more money. That'll create more happiness, or most people will have more money, right? You might hear someone on the left argue, well, we should say do more to pay for people's education, because if we do, that'll have economic benefits. They'll get better jobs, they'll pay more in taxes, they'll maybe invent stuff, do this, make this investment, it'll create the most happiness, right? If you start paying attention, a lot of our debates about distributive justice, a lot of the arguments people on both the right and the left argue are made in utilitarian terms. And on the surface, this does seem to be an attractive way to think about justice. You could reduce everything to psychology and economics, maybe, right? We think that if we, or some people who favor this say, well, if we take this utilitarian approach, we can make these questions of distributive justice into almost a science, or even into a science. This is kind of the promise of utilitarianism generally. We want to talk about distributive justice. Well, we just need to think about psychology, what makes people happy, and economics. How do we make sure people get those things that make them happy, right? Okay, so obvious attractions with the utilitarian approach, and it is one people often reach for when thinking about these issues. So what's wrong with utilitarianism? Why doesn't Rawls like it? Well, Rawls doesn't like it, and I don't think we should either, because utilitarianism seems to miss something that's very important. And it misses something that I think is important to both sides, both left and right in the political debate. Let me give you guys a couple of examples of some utilitarian reasoning and how it would miss something. All right, so let's imagine, I'll give you guys an example. Let's take this guy, we'll call him Jim. I'm actually thinking of a real person I know, but I guess I shouldn't, especially if I'm going to upload this on the internet where maybe he or his mom could find it. I shouldn't use the real name. And again, if they did find it, it'd be pretty apparent who I'm talking about. But anyway, I'll at least not use his real name. So this guy, we'll call him Jim, is the laziest person I have ever known in my life. He's bright, he's charming, but he is just incredibly lazy. And he set up this business that he can kind of scrape by. He still lives with his mom because, God help, he has to pay rent. But he set up this business where he can work about 3 months out of 12, and the rest he just doesn't do anything except play computer games or apparently, if he has the money, occasionally travel, right? So this guy doesn't make much money. I haven't asked him. I'm guessing he probably earns, 13, 14,000 a year, right? If you don't need to pay rent, and mom still does the cooking, that'll get you by, right? Well, why do I talk about this guy? Well, look, I'm going to bet that given as little as Jim makes, if you were to take $500 from me, I make a bit more than he does. I'm going to guess if you were to take $500 from me and give it to him, he would be really happy, right? It would create a lot of happiness. 500 will mean more to him than it does to me. I would, though, be incredibly annoyed if the government were to take my money and give it to Jim, right? And if their reasoning was, well, look, you make more than he does. If you make more money, 500 means less to you than it does him. Yes, it'll annoy you to lose your money, but it'll buy so much more happiness with Jim, because just think of how much of an increase in his year-to-year income that is, right? Think of how many video games he can buy. Maybe he can take that trip to wherever it is here, right? That's good utilitarian reasoning. But even if it did make him happier, even if the happiness it created for Jim outweighs the annoyance it does for me, taking the money, I don't think it would be justified, because I don't think he would deserve it, right? It's not fair to take my money and give it to this guy who doesn't have money because he's so incredibly lazy, right? Even if it would make him happy, I would drag my heels and say, whoa, 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 this guy does not deserve it, right? So that's a sort of conservative, on the right sort of objection to this utilitarian approach. But we can also think of objections to utilitarian approach on the left. Think about our debates about unemployment, right? Imagine, we have a huge depression, or we have something like we did with coronavirus, where a lot of people lose their job through no fault of their own. And imagine somebody says, well, I don't think we should provide you with unemployment because, that discourages people from getting a job. In the long term, I don't know if this is true, but let's assume it is. In the long term, the economy will recover quicker if we just let things shake out. If we give you unemployment, you won't take a job at a lower wage because you don't have to. Things will just last longer. Now, I don't know if that's true. I'm no economist, but you will hear people make this argument sometimes. But even if it's true, it seems to miss something, right? Imagine that you're the person on unemployment and you're in a desperate position. You're like, well, I'm going to lose my house if I don't get some help. It's no fault of my own. This terrible thing happened and I lost my job. and someone says to you, well, that stinks for you. Yeah, I can see why you're upset, but you know what? For society as a whole, this really stinks for you, but for society as a whole, we'll get out of this a little quicker if we just don't give you unemployment, if we let you lose your house. You say, well, but that's going to make me really unhappy. I don't see how that's justified. It's like, oh, no, no, of course, you're going to be miserable. But your sacrifices are for society as a whole, which are going to be way happier, so you see it's justified, right? Now, look, I don't know. I'm not an economist. I don't even know if that economic story is true. But even if it were, that seems to miss something, right? Is it fair to ask this person who lost his job through no fault of his own to sacrifice for the quote unquote good of society? I don't think it is, right? So both people on the left and right would say, because it gives this weird answer to these questions, that utilitarianism misses something very important in thinking about distributive justice. And what it misses is this thought of fairness, right? If somebody wanted to take my money and give it to Jim, exactly what annoys me about that is that I don't think it's fair. What seems so awful about telling somebody who lost his job through no fault of his own that he needs to make these huge sacrifices for society and the economy is that is not fair, right? So remember, utilitarianism doesn't really do well with fairness. But Rawls will say, well, when we talk about justice, not just distributive justice, but justice generally, isn't fairness a huge part of justice? Isn't it even the main part? Rawls will say that justice just is fairness. That's all we mean by justice, is being fair. But even if we don't want to go as far as Rawls does, justice is, fairness is still a huge part of justice, and utilitarianism just doesn't seem like it can factor fairness in as something that's important. So that's why Rawls wants to take a different approach. That's why he thinks utilitarianism is not a good approach to justice. We'll see, even Nozick, who very much disagrees with where Rawls goes with this, will agree with Rawls. Utilitarianism is a bad way to think about justice. That much they agree on, not much else.